you don't the way to avoid tainting the expert is allowing them the access to the people and the documents, and then allowing them to test the propositions of the corporate narrative.
So Lena's going to talk a little bit about contemporaneous documents in a minute. Before we get to that, I want to finish off with disclosure obligations. And I think, Brendan, you mentioned earlier the idea of disclosure of draft expert reports. So under what circumstances will those need to be produced to an opposing party?
Yeah, well, and the good news is the law, again, for those of you who may have been doing this game for a while, you'll remember sort of 10 years ago, it was really in the direction that it was all kind of open season. As a result of which you had some odd practices in retrospect that, like in 2002, were all the rage, which were, this draft report, we'll just feed that right through the shredder as soon as we're done the meeting, because we don't want those drafts to ever be produced, and if they don't exist, they can't be produced. Now, 2017, the reality is, that's an utter fallacy because, from a technical perspective, you can shred away all you want, but you can't destroy the document. John will find an expert who will find the original electronic metadata somewhere. So keep that thought in mind. There's no point in destroying the drafts because you can't destroy them from a technological perspective anyways. But now, thankfully, the presumption is that it's under litigation privilege. And John earlier summarized the Glaholt case, and that's one of the important principles that came out of there, is that the judge said the starting point is there's litigation privilege that attaches to those drafts and to the communications with the experts. What's that? What does that mean? It means because we're preparing that for the dominant purpose of litigation, it doesn't have to be produced to the other side as our starting point. So that's kind of the good news. And when that case came out, there was kind of a sigh of relief because the trial judge's decision had caused all sorts of stress and alarm. Because the trial judge had said, look, the lawyer shouldn't be talking to the expert on the phone because we're worried that they might be tainting them in the course of that conversation. So, the idea was that maybe the law was now saying the expert had to be in a bubble, which for all the reasons we discussed just would really, I think, fundamentally undermine the system. So the Court of Appeal has said we start with the proposition that they're protected. So don't send your juniors to the shredding machine anymore because from a technological perspective it doesn't matter and it's not necessary. But on the other hand, now we're thinking of, okay, there's an exception to every rule at law, right? So when do they get produced? Well, if there's reasonable grounds to suspect that the lawyer or the party has coached that expert in a particular direction, where there are reasonable grounds. So now we're almost in, like an episode of Law and Order. Your Honor, there's reasonable grounds here for a search warrant. Your Honor, there's reasonable grounds to suspect that this expert has been improperly coached. I've thought about that in the last couple of years since that decision came out. Like, what are those reasonable grounds? Like, how would you prove that if I'm, trying to get at those drafts? Because I think that there's some cross-examination points to be scored in there. Well, again, like a broken record, I'll get back to that original cover letter, sending out the scope of the retainer. What is it that we're asking the expert to do precisely? That is one of the documents, I think, that the other side's going to look at and say, okay, are there any alarm bells in here in this scope of retainer that we could look at and say, right from the get-go, this expert was marched off in a very particular direction on this file. And this would give the basis for us to say to the court there's reasonable grounds for suspicion here. Another little document in that pack that the judge is going to get is going to be a list of all the documents the expert that he or she has reviewed in the course of preparing their report. And you can imagine, look, if that list just reeks of they've been directed in one particular direction and not looked at other stuff that in fact may be unhelpful to the case, that's when maybe there might be, in the real world, an ability to argue, these are reasonable grounds. And now we should get access to these drafts, these emails, et cetera, that normally should be protected from disclosure. And you definitely don't want to throw gasoline on the fire by saying, well, we can't give you the drafts now, notwithstanding the reasonable grounds to suspect coaching because we've destroyed them. So, I mean, you can imagine, now the court's really going to draw an inference. And more to the point, again, some technical expert will be able to get those drafts on a computer anyways. Let's face it, in this age of, Russia, of course, fake news, we all know you can't destroy computer documents forever, so why bother? I think would be The answer, the one takeaway is we're no longer destroying expert drafts.
So keeping in mind some of those thoughts, Ali and Steve, are there any particular communication strategies you prefer to use when working with lawyers and with your clients?
I guess first off, I fundamentally, and I think everybody at the table would agree, I mean, these things have to be set up at the start of the engagement. It's really hard to unwrap something after you've gone down a path that somebody else, whether it's counsel or the client or somebody's not happy with the way that the communication is taking place. I think in spite of certain of the decisions, there's still, from certain legal counsel, still a real push to make everything not be in writing. So there's a push to have Skype meetings, there's a push to have phone calls, there's a push to have those things. And on at a certain level, I'm fundamentally okay with that, but I also need to have in my file something that I can use to defend myself if somebody's going to suggest that I was unduly tainted. So, I take it upon myself, for major discussion points on approach and major discussion points on issues, I'll always document everything I do from when it's a verbal interaction or a change, just so that if anybody does challenge me, I can say that, I prepared a memo at the date of that call. This is the main issues, and this is what the conclusions coming out of it, because I think there's a real concern there.
No, an old habits die hard, not to just get bogged down in the Advocate Society guidelines, but again, they say don't destroy your drafts. That's actually right in there. But they also say assume that you might have to produce your drafts someday. Right. So, but think of it this way. The default now is you don't have to produce them, okay? So that you're in that safety square right from the get-go. The only way you're going to have to produce them is if there's reasonable grounds to suspect that you've unfairly coached your expert. Why throw gasoline on that fire by now saying, well, you're not going to get any drafts or any notes from us because we were careful to Skype everything. We destroyed everything. We don't have anything. You can't get anything. Now the court's going to have no problem drawing adverse inferences against you. So I think in the end, help him do his job.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't keep everything up here all the time. There has to be some work product.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to defend an assumed statement that this, sir, you were tainted in this way or this way. If I don't have anything in my file to say no, that isn't the fact. Absolutely. So it's very difficult.
All right. So we got some important material in the next section, but we've had a request on the live stream just to make sure everyone's microphones are up and going through. I think John's I'm hearing really well. I'm not sure about everyone else's, so maybe just make sure that's going.
Okay. Thanks, Derek. So we've talked a little bit, and we've touched on the importance of experts' access to primary sources and contemporaneous project documents, and not just relying on a groupthink or a corporate narrative. So I would like to hear from Ali and Steve. What do you look for when you're looking for contemporaneous documents? We'll start with Steve from your perspective and then move on to Ali.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm looking for consistency in something that will pass a smell test. I mean, I am looking for, if we're claiming that this event occurred on this date and it caused this expansion in labor hours, well, the time records better support that, right? So we're looking for that to happen. But we're also looking for other evidence that would support the case. So in other words, the best files that we work on, there's been somebody who's been documenting issues, documenting decisions as the project progressed. They've been taking photographs of the issue. They've been, showing that you had to dig an extra 5 feet to accomplish something, or we had to frame something out. So I think those are critical. And I also think that there's, in our cases that we like to work with, and we discussed this the other day, I also like to have evidence from external parties in and around the same time that would support cost charge. So in other words, if there's self-performed work or there's something along those lines and we're charging X number of dollars for it, that I can say that from a third-party perspective, that's a reasonable cost. So I look for those type of things.
Ali?
So in very simple terms, what we do as the lay experts is really try and compare the planned execution of work to the actual execution. So for the planned execution of work, the first thing we look at is the baseline schedule, the first schedule agreed between the parties, and any narrative that was issued at around the same time that explains what their planned execution was, and most importantly, what they considered as critical during the project. And then ideally, at the very end, you have your actual execution. So you would build an as-built using the contemporaneous document, which includes daily reports, photographs, really any record that was prepared during the project that could help prove the actual dates that are included in a schedule. And then the actual mechanism to explain the difference between the plan and the actual can vary. You can use the contemporaneous project schedule updates at times when those aren't available. Then you really just use the plan and try and understand what happened during the course of the project through the meeting minutes, through the monthly reports, anything that the contractor prepared at the time that explained what was critical, what was impacting their work. So we really look for the issues that were encountered on the project from the horse's mouth. That's the most important.
Thanks. And Steve and Ali, what general advice do you have for our clients in the construction industry with respect to document management during the course of a project? Steve, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, as soon as you have that feeling that this is not going to go well, or you have a feeling that there's going to be some form of delay or some issue with the owner or the manager, or in the case of a sub with the general contractor, I mean, it makes our life a lot easier if you get ahead of the curve and you start documenting at that point. You find, and it's consistent across the majority of our cases, that you're trying to recreate what happened 2 or 3 years later. It's very difficult. Where if you had done it at the point you knew you potentially had a problem, I think you're going to be much better off. So that's what I would suggest. And then for the document management piece, that's a whole other discussion on what we want to see and stuff. So we'll get to that, I think.
Lee.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is how that information is stored. So one is actually recording the information. And then the second part is, well, how do you record it? Do you record your daily reports as PDFs? Or do you actually insert it into an Excel file or some way that the information can be extracted easily? And some contractors may think, well, that's only useful if there's a dispute later on the project, but it's actually useful in contract administration reasons, right? When you're on the project and the contractor issues a change, well, you have an actual record of what happened, at a certain foundation, what the change was, how long it impacted the work. You can actually see in real time what was the effect of a certain change or event. So I would say just to think about how the information is recorded on a project, and it could be something as simple as an Excel sheet. You don't need a very fancy system.
In terms of recording, I guess, information as the project unfolds, what advice would you have in terms of the level of detail that gets incorporated, let's say, into a picture, or how a photograph is taken that then best serves your purpose later? We'll start with you, Ali. And I know, John, we've talked about clients taking photographs and how to do that in the best way to help us.
I love, sometimes you get photographs from clients and you're looking at the photograph and you're scratching your head and you're trying to figure out exactly what the photograph is showing. One of my favorites, of course, is the tape measure in the photograph. And it's taken from such a distance that you can't even figure out what the numbers are on the tape measure or what it's intending to measure. So make sure that the photos that you take are meaningful and that they show what it is that you intend to show with them. The other thing that I tell clients to do is, if you have a project that's going to occur over a number of years and you're going to take photographs of it, try and take a plan view of the project site, mark out whatever it is, 10, 20 locations, number them all, put an arrow which will indicate the direction of the photograph, and then walk around the site, whether it's once a week, twice a week, whatever it is, and stand in the exact same spot, facing the exact same way, taking the photograph. Now you have points of reference. Every week, same view, and you can see the project being built through these photographs. And I think in some cases that becomes very important. And instead, you just get a mass of photos taken from different angles or different perspectives, and you're trying to piece it together. And then the other part of it is the management of those photographs. You get a CD from the client, the photographs have a JPEG number, and you're left scratching your head. The client should create a photograph log. Put the date, the number of photos that were taken, the number, indicate the number, which then correlates back to the number on the drawing. And now you have an excellent piece of evidence that you can use in any litigation if you need it. If you don't need it, then you have wonderful photographs that you can put up on your wall in your offices, which is a good thing. But if you do need to rely on it, you have an excellent piece of evidence that you can give to your experts and your lawyers to work with.
Thanks, John. Steve and Ali, do you have anything to add? It doesn't have to be photographs, just documents.
I was actually going to say photographs.
Well, go ahead, yeah.
I just find that I'd second exactly what John is saying, is to be systematic about how the photographs are taken. And it's hard to dispute a photograph, right, especially when it's date stamped. It provides really good evidence, and I would agree with you.
I guess we should add to that something that might become an issue is what they call the chain of custody. So try and have the same individual take the photographs all the time, have the photographs on, for example, like an external hard drive that person maintains, so that person can give evidence and say, I took all these photographs, I had control of the hard drive, and nobody else did. And that way, you're preserving the evidence so that somebody cannot say that the photos were somehow tampered with or tainted.
The only other thing I would add is I find it, from our perspective, is that in spite of you maybe not getting a response from the owner or the general contractor, whoever it is, to actually just document why you're making certain decisions and have them, at least it arrived on their desk, and if they chose not to do anything about it, it certainly says that you at the time you're making a decision or you're taking an action, this is the thought process as to why we did it, and we've informed you of it. So I think that's a good strategy as well.
And Steve, speaking from a financial records perspective, if an issue arises during a project, would you recommend that the client starts maybe creating an additional cost code to track that issue, and maybe give us some reasons why or why not?
I would think that that's best practice. I mean, I think it's difficult to divide out hours after the fact and to rationalize it. And if you've actually got your staff coding extra time spent on something to a different job code or something, I mean, that's the best evidence you're going to get that the actual person doing the work recognized it was outside of the general scope of the contract and was doing it, or you've made a decision to track it. I don't think you could ever lose that argument. I think it's the best way to go.
And most accounting systems, of course, used today are capable of just adding another project number.
Very much so.
Okay. So now, fast forwarding to, I guess, when a dispute has materialized, this is a question for our experts. How would you prefer to obtain and review project documents? So the two, I guess, options, and there's probably more than two options, but the two that I'm posing for you is you could have access to a database of all the project documents. You can search through them on your own, or you could have a very targeted request, and someone would feed you those specific documents. Which one would you prefer? And we'll go with Ali first.
I prefer to have all the documents up front, and really to have, again, the client sit with me and explain where the document the documents are saved, how they're organized. The advantage of that is it's difficult to know what to ask for when you don't know what types of records were maintained on a project. You don't know. The project documents vary greatly between projects, so I always find it's helpful to gain the access to the entire documents, and then that way you know exactly what's available. You're less likely to be caught by surprise with a certain type of record you didn't know was available. That's always been my preference.
Thanks. Anything to add, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I want both. I may be greedy, I'm not sure, but I want both. I don't think you can actually meet your standards of independence and objectivity if you can't say that you've actually made some attempts independently to look at the records and the documents and see if you're missing it. I mean, there can be nothing worse to an expert than to have a document put in front of him that he's not aware of that would significantly change his opinion on something that was right there available for him to see. So I think it's critical.
Yeah, just to kind of tie it back to what might happen if the thing does go to court. If someone's wanting to poke behind that report and see drafts and challenge the expert's objectivity and all the rest of it, that list of documents that have been reviewed, and maybe even more to the point, what hasn't been reviewed, I think might open the door to that sort of inquiry, even under the current case law.
Okay, so we're going to do one more question for our panelists, and then we'll take some questions from the audience or participants via webcast. And this last question relates to the Construction Lien Act reform. which we know includes a scheme for statutory adjudication, which includes a very short turnaround time for the adjudication of disputes. Brendan, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on how that will impact the way clients retain and work with experts during the project and subsequent disputes.
Yeah, I think it underscores what Steve has been talking about, the idea of being proactive once your spider sense is tingling, if I can use that
Right.
comic book analogy, to retain the expert earlier rather than later, because as I understand it in the UK, and there's others in the room who might have much better experience in the UK than I do, but from what I've read at least and what I've been told, is that there's a real advantage in an adjudication scheme to being the party initiating the adjudication. You've got time to get your ducks in a row, including getting your expert lined up, and then you launch your adjudication, and the other side has 28 days to respond. And so if you haven't had anyone lined up yet at that point, you're going to be really under the gun to get that done in basically about 4 weeks. That being said, I think if we do get adjudication, and all signs are pointing in that direction in Ontario, I think there's going to have to be kind of a culture shift at all levels, including experts and lawyers, because you're not going to be able to reproduce a trial-like experience that we've been talking about in a 28-day window, even if you have been proactive in the retainer. It's going to be much more of a, what are the really important things we need to cover here in a summary way. And I think there's going to have to be a lot more tolerance sort of on the part of adjudicators as to, why an expert may not have overturned every single stone just because it can't be done in 28 days.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience here in person?
I'll just ask one, following up on the adjudication point. Given the interim nature, the fact that you'll have a lot of these adjudications, but potentially still an overall litigation claim at the end of a project, how do you foresee those little expert reports factoring into a subsequent complete report, and what happens if an opinion might change in the interim?
I'm not sure, but I believe the process is essentially scrapped. So once you decide to litigate the issue at the end of the project, what was done during the adjudication process is essentially scrapped, and you're starting fresh. Because the adjudicator's decision at that point is non-binding.
Yeah, it's only binding on an interim basis.
Yeah. So I don't think hopefully it won't have much of an impact, but at least you'll understand the other side's case and have a preview of it well in advance of proceeding with litigation or arbitration.
Yeah. I think one of the fundamental differences we're going to find in this province from the United Kingdom is they don't have a lien act in Britain. So it's one thing to say there that you don't end up going to court, because why bother? It's sort of out in the wash of finishing the project, and the adjudicator's decisions stand. But what about where you've got the leverage of being able to require the other side to post security? I think it's hard to predict with exact certainty how this is going to unfold, but I think at least in the short term, what we're going to see in Ontario is people are still going to register liens, because they'll be able to force the other side to post security, or they'll tie up land, and that gives them some leverage. And there's going to be, I think, an interesting tension. Notwithstanding what John said, it's difficult, I think, to pretend that certain information and analysis doesn't exist. I mean, the other side will know what you've put forward, and they'll know sort of maybe areas of vulnerability to attack. So, whether you'll have a truly clean slate for the case going forward or not, I think remains to be seen.
Yep.
So we've got a question from our webcast, and it relates to contemporaneous documents and specifically meeting minutes, and how much weight, as an expert, you place on those in disputes, and in particular construction lien proceedings.
Well, the one thing I would say is meeting minutes, especially whether it's a project coordination meeting or just a project review meeting, usually they discuss the main issues that are being encountered on the project, so whatever's really impacting their work. The one thing to add is to be careful with who's drafting the meetings, because they do become part of the record. And at times, the story that's recorded in the meeting minutes, it's not that it's not true, but there's not a response. There's always two sides to a story. So, if the owner is issuing meeting minutes, I think it's good practice for the contractor to actually review them in detail and to make sure what's being stated is actually accurate.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very important to have that accurate record. And so although the minutes of meetings come as of course, review them, take the time to review them and make sure that they are, in fact, they do record what was discussed or what was decided at that meeting.
Yeah, again, I balance, the source and who's actually, party to them. And if both parties have agreed to them, I think they're incredibly valuable. If they're not, you've got to weigh it. So,
I know from my own experience, I've seen where meeting minutes are issued by one party, immediately thereafter, the other party will issue a response and be very careful to note any item they don't exactly agree with the wording of, to make sure that their response is contemporaneously on the record.
Yeah, I've seen projects where the owner will prepare the minutes, send them over to the contractor, and the contractor actually notes their acceptance of the minutes as drafted by signing and returning the copy back.
Andrea, I think I saw your hand go up.
Panel discussed earlier the partiality of experts and how that can sometimes be put at issue and ways to avoid that. I'm wondering, is there an obligation on the opposing counsel to raise that as an issue in the proceeding, or is that something that you could find yourself at trial and then opposing counsel is now attacking the partiality of your expert and you're sort of caught by this? And of course, I'm sure it relates to just being a good advocate to begin with, but I'm just wondering, is there any type of obligation to be raising that if you're on the other side, or can you sort of show up at trial and raise it for the first time and say, your expert was biased?
Well, I think, generally speaking, you'll get a sense from opposing counsel whether or not they believe that your expert has been impartial. And the issue of impartiality and bias is generally used to throw out the expert's report. And so you'd want to do that before the expert even gives evidence. So you'd find out at trial, I guess, but you'd know ahead of time that that was coming and you'd be able to address it.
Yeah, I think particularly if we're talking about the issue of getting behind the report to get drafts and things like that to try to discredit the expert report. I mean, you're going to get that through a discovery process, because by the time you get to trial, it's kind of too late to sort of try to construct that case. If the shoe's on the other foot, if you want to try to discredit that expert, I think you've got to bring that forward earlier. Otherwise,
It typically
you run the
arises
risk
much
of
earlier.
having lost that opportunity.
yeah. I think you tend to get a good flavor for it in the rebuttal reports.
Yep.
Right. I think when you see the way, the commentary in the rebuttal reports, you get a good indication of where that's heading.
Yeah, usually under the heading, the expert failed to review.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've had another question from the live stream about how the upcoming changes to the Construction Lien Act will otherwise impact the role of experts in disputes.
How it'll affect the role of experts generally? Oh, I think experts will still be. You'll still need an expert to give opinions on the issue. Keep in mind that in an adjudication, you take an issue to adjudication. So at least it's the experts' reports will generally be very focused and on the one issue. So hopefully that'll allow them the time then to put together the expert's report. And maybe not all issues require an expert report. Some will, some won't. I think you have to assess it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think the other folks that are going to be busy, I mean, all the cynics have pointed out, of course, that the lawyers are going to be busy, which, again, that seems to be true. But I think quantity surveyors in their particular area of expertise is going to be very much in demand. This is, not just with respect to the adjudication aspect, but with respect to the prompt payment provisions, the proper invoice issue, the challenging of a proper invoice, the requirement now to notify of set-off in advance. Woohoo! I have to admit that's one of my bugbears, but I think that's a good change. Again, but that you can see where, as somebody with quantity surveying expertise, if this new Construction Lien Act takes hold, that there's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a fundamental change in the way the construction firms have to account for things.
Yep.
I mean, they're going to have to be more diligent. They're going to have to get to issues like you asked me about, which is a separate job coding for issues that are, outside of the normal terms of the contract. Yeah, clearly.
Keeping excellent records that are available at a moment's notice. Yep.
Do we have any other questions from the audience or webcast area? No. Okay, so if there are no other questions, that wraps up our panel today. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks to the panelists.
Thanks, Tina.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, it was good.